Today we come to look at the book of 2 Samuel. Remember, in the original, it was really just one book. But because it's such a long book, they split it into two parts. Now, let's do a quick review of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel, the Israelites rejected God as their king. They said, "We want a king like the other nations." Now, of course, God had been their king all along. They said, "We want a king to fight our wars." And God had been fighting their wars for them. I mean, how in the world did a band of helpless slaves survive 40 years in the wilderness? No water, no food. Who provided? Obviously, a king had provided food for them. They entered into the promised land. They crossed the Jordan. People who don't know how to fight. These were fortified cities, huge fortified cities, 31 of them. And they conquered them one after another. Walls fall down, thunder comes, earthquakes, sun stands still. Who did all that? God, right? So obviously God had fought their wars. But no, they say we want a king like the other nations. In other words, we want someone we can see, someone visible, someone impressive. Not so much effective, but impressive. This is the nature of man, the folly of man. They like to see something impressive. Most political leaders, kings, look very impressive. Actually, they are all paper tigers. Many politicians look so impressive and everybody looks up to them. Idolatry. Nowadays we say we look up to someone, a sports star. We need someone to idolize. It's idolatry, modern form, not in a graven image, but in a person. We all make idols about jobs, we make idols of people, and everything. We like to have something visible we can just spend all our respect to and all our life to serve that thing. Could be a job, could be a house, a home, your dream home, whatever. It's all this idolatry of the various kinds, right? So, God allows them. You want a king like that? We'll give you a king. So he gives them exactly what they yearn for. The tallest guy in town, the tallest king of all the kings. He was like a head, shoulders over everybody else. And this king, called Saul, started very well. I mean, he won wars for them, etc. And then in the second half of 1 Samuel, we see him really coming down. Now from this point, the second half of 1 Samuel, he's not fighting their wars, he's fighting his war. His war against his personal competitor, David. He just felt that I cannot stand anybody competing with me. And so he spends his entire life focused on this one person called David. And it's quite tiring to read the second half of 1 Samuel because it's just reading endless chasing of a man running here, going to this cave, going to these woods, hiding, pretending to be somebody else. It's tiring. It's almost like watching those cartoons where the bad guy chases the good guy. It's like, if it wasn't a cartoon, if it was a cartoon, it might be bearable. But to have to read all that, it lasted 40 years. Saul was king for 40 years. So 40 years of envy sent him crazy. Literally, he ended up looking for a witch to help him figure out what to do. He couldn't think straight. And he finally committed suicide. So their first attempt to get a king after their own idea of a king failed miserably. But the second half of 1 Samuel shows another king coming up. At the time Saul was going down, another king was coming up, this good guy called David. Well, he was quite amazing. As he was being chased left and right, He never complained. He never murmured against God. In his faith in God never wavered. He just was willing to wait out the promise of God that he would be the next king. He never lifted a finger. He had two clear opportunities to kill Saul, and he didn't do it because he trusted that God would fulfill his promise. He didn't have to hurry it. He didn't have to help God in that sense, right? So amazing start in the end of the second half of 1 Samuel. Another king comes out and whoa, there is so much promise again. It doesn't sound so familiar when we see new leaders come up, new corporate leaders come up, new political leaders come up, new systems come up, everybody. This is the solution to all our problems. All right, that's how it always begins, and then it always comes bang, crashing down. Very sad. All right, so we begin the 2 Samuel. Now let's look at 2 Samuel. We see the reign of David, right? David was 30 years old. Saul had committed suicide in the past book of 1 Samuel. So David is 30 years old, and Bible tells us he reigned for 40 years too, right? The first three kings of Israel reigned for 40 years. Saul, David, Solomon, all reigned for 40 years. The number 40 is quite significant in biblical numbers. 40 is usually a time of testing. 40 years in the wilderness, for example, 40 days of fasting, when Moses went up to Mount Sinai. So the kings were given 40 years to test whether they got good quality or bad quality, whether they would pass or whether they would fail. So his 40-year reign, the first 7 years of his reign was in the city of Hebron, where he did not reign over all Israel because a large part was still loyal to Saul, right? Saul's son was still alive, Ishbosheth. And so the first 7 years he reigned in Hebron, a city of the the tribe of Judah, of which is David's tribe. Then the next 33 years he reigned over a unified Israel, and that was from the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so he's 30 years old, just as Christ started his public ministry at the age of 30. David started his kingdom as king at the age of 30, and he lasted for 40 years. By far, David is the greatest king that Israel ever had. He brought the borders of Israel to its, I would say, to its biblical boundaries. God had said, this is your land, this promised land. And the rest of the kings had bits of the promise. They never had the faith to claim it all, right? Because God had said, this is your land, it's given to you. Go and possess it. Possess it by faith. Take a step of faith to conquer the land. And David did that. Okay, so basically his kingdom was like the golden age of Israel. Up to today, the Jews are still waiting for a king like David. Though it's quite funny, the king like David we're going to read is not really the king that I would want, all right? But anyway, they don't know any better, so they don't believe that Jesus is the king. So this is they're waiting for a coming king. Now, just for the numbers, when David finally rises up and the kingdom becomes the kingdom that seems to be the kingdom God has promised, it took 1,000 years from the time God told Abraham, walk through this land, right? This is the land I will give you and your descendants. But before that, you have to go into Egypt to await the fullness of the sin of the Amorites. In other words, you don't conquer the land yet, Abraham. First, you're too few. You need to go to Egypt, grow a bit more. But number two, you have no right to conquer them now. Though they're evil at the time of Abraham, Lot, And Sodom, you know how evil the land was already, rampant sex everywhere, men on the street screaming out for anyone to have sex with them, temples full of sex. But God said, not yet, not yet, until the fullness of the Amorites, right? So God allowed their wickedness to reach a certain point of no return, so to speak, right? It was 1,000 years from Abraham, the promise given to Abraham, until finally David's kingdom comes up. 1,000 years. Wow, that's a long time, okay? Like we are now in the year 2000. Imagine back to the year 1000. Who was there? I mean, which kings were there in England, or which Singapore didn't exist, Philippines didn't exist as a nation. I mean, we're talking a long time. So first we understand the character of God. We also understand the time span of God. One day with God is as 1,000 years for us. But for us, it's like, God, why take so long? Why so long, right? Because we live in very short time span as opposed to the God who lives in eternity, all right? So this gives you not only the character of God, but the time span, the time frame that God works in, so to speak, all right? So David became this great king. How did he really become a great king? By conquering the last stronghold in Canaan called Jerusalem. The Jebusites continued to live in the city of Jebus, right? Before it was called Jerusalem, Jebus. And no judge, no Israelite could ever enter the city. It was on this amazing, what we call, location. In the days of the past, a strong fort was not on its walls alone, but on its location. Because, you don't have aeroplanes, you don't have missiles and all that. You have to literally climb up. In Jerusalem, 3 sides of the city of Jerusalem on which it's built, on the mountain on which it is built, 3 sides are steep slopes. So Jebus, or Jerusalem, is built right on this top of this amazing strategic place, and nobody could conquer it. And so they laughed when David was trying to conquer it. He said, even the blind and the lame in Jebus will defend the city. But David, one of his men, found a water tunnel that went into the city. Okay, you can read that in, I think, 2 Samuel chapter 7. They entered the city, they conquered the city, and it became renamed Jerusalem, the city of David, sometimes called Zion. Okay, there are names that more or less mean the same thing. There are subtle differences. Jerusalem. Every time you think salam, shalom. Shalom, peace. If you're Muslim, you say salam, right? Even the name Solomon, all right, Shlomon, is actually all from the word peace. So Jerusalem basically means city of peace. So finally, after 400 years in the promised land, they conquered the last stronghold. Okay, you remember, we understand the promised land is a place where we have the will of God, but still there are strongholds in our lives, sins that we need to conquer to get the peace, the total peace with God. Before that, we have peace, but not total, because some sins keep popping up and troubling our relationship with God. Some sins that we cannot get rid of, right? There are strongholds in our life. Maybe a certain sin we won't let go, a certain pride, a certain ego, certain things in our life that we can give everything up for God except that, right? So Jerusalem speaks of the last stronghold, and when that last stronghold was captured, really the kingdom was at rest. The kingdom was at peace. They were now in the promised land that was given to them, and now they possess the peace that they should have had much, much earlier if they had conquered these strongholds, right? So when David had conquered Jerusalem, this is what he did. He built himself a beautiful home, and then he felt so guilty that he lived in this beautiful home, and God's place was still a tent, a tabernacle. You know, it's so old already. It's 400 years old, 500 years old. This tent, I'm sure it looked pretty shabby and worn out. Can you imagine the sun, something for the red covering of the tabernacle, you know? We said it was red, skins dyed red. I wonder what red looks like after 500 years. It's probably already a pale pink left, you know, and dirt and everything, all right? So the tabernacle looked so bad, and David said, no, God, I want to build a house for you. I want to build a house for you. And then the prophet said to him, of course, go and build a house. Then later God said to the prophet, no, David cannot build a house. He's a man of war, blood, all right? And later Solomon, whose name is Peace, would build the tabernacle, the temple, all right? So David wants to build God a house. That is, I think, in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And it's 11 verse 13, he said, I will make you a house, he said to God. But in 2 Samuel 7 verse 16, God says something quite unusual. You don't build me a house. I'm happy to live in tents. You know, that's really the character of God. When Jesus came, he didn't have a house. Foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He had no permanent address. Okay? And the tabernacle was moved here, moved there, it moved so many places, all right? But this is what God said to David. You want to build me a house? That's nice. That's good. But your son will do it. You're a man of war. You got blood on your hands. You can't build this tabernacle, which is a symbol of God having peace with man, right? But I will build you a house. 2 Samuel 7 verse 16. I will build you a dynasty, and your throne will be established forever. Wow. A throne that can be established. You know, Chinese dynasties, 500 years, 600 years. Well, that's very long already for a dynasty. Forever. Then later you see, the royal line of David goes off into exile, and the kings are all... What happened to the royal line of Israel? How come God's promise? Where is the promise? Thy throne shall be established forever. I'll build you a house forever. A dynasty forever. But you and I know, 1,000 years later, a humble couple called Joseph and Mary, both of whom are descendants of David. The genealogy is given. Both. Joseph, the legal father of Jesus, not biological, because Jesus had no father except the Holy Spirit. But the legal father of Jesus is Joseph. He's a descendant of David. And Mary, the biological mother, because Jesus is 100% God from the Holy Spirit, 100% human from Mary. Mary is also a descendant of Jesus. And Jesus will be king of the Jews first, then king of the church today, and king of the world in the new heaven and the new earth. All right, so I hope you see the promise is fulfilled. 1,000 years after David was told, your throne will be established forever, okay, in the form of Jesus, the king that we are talking about. You see, God wanted us to be redeemed by a king, but his version of a king was very different from their version of a king, but nonetheless, he allowed it. God is so wise. In the end, he just works it back into his redemption plan. Okay? So we see here David, now, there's this promise from God, his throne will be established forever. I don't think he probably grasped it as, oh, okay, Solomon will be there, and then after Solomon, Solomon's son, and my, just physically go on. Okay? Now, after this beautiful promise given to David, something happens. In chapter 11, it says, when at the time when kings go forth to war, it's a time for war. In winter they don't go to war. They go to war when the weather is better. Those days they fought quite different style from us. Okay, the war was like one army line up against another army, and then to save bloodshed, that's how you see the story of David and Goliath. Instead of all them smashing each other, killing each other, too much blood, right? They have a different format. Okay, you send your champion, I send my champion, we challenge, and whose champion wins, then that side wins. Like playing chess, you get the king, you win already. Okay, so they had this going to war at a certain time. So at the time when kings go to war, what happened is David didn't go to war. You see, Israeli kings led the fight. Up to today, Israeli army generals lead in the front. All right, our generals are very different. We sit and draw the plans. Then we tell men, you go and fight. All right, but Israeli army generals are very different. They actually go to the front. And so the Bible tells us that David didn't go for some reason. He got complacent. He's a big king now. He's got a huge kingdom. Everything seems to be at rest. He sends Joab and his army to go out. He stays home. And when he stays home, when he's out of God's will, he saw a woman, a beautiful woman, taking a bath on the roof. It was quite normal in those days. And from his roof, he could see her. And he lusted after this woman. And then we know the rest of the story. Bathsheba and David, right? In Bathsheba, in the sin with Bathsheba, we see him committing 5 sins at one time. The 10 commandments, there are 10. He committed 5 at one go, right? With this one woman, he covets her. He steals another man's wife. He commits adultery with her. Then he lies, and then he kills this person, Uriah, her husband. Okay? So here we see the downfall of David. After this, one after another of problems. One of his sons rapes a stepsister, one of his daughters, right? And then the brother of this girl who got raped, Absalom, says, no way, I'm going to get revenge. Then he kills his stepbrother, Amnon. And then afterwards, Absalom, I'm just cutting a long story short because we don't need to go through all that. Absalom then, what he does is he rebels against David. And David had to flee like a fugitive. This great king sitting up there, in this mighty great kingdom, the pride of Israel, runs like a fugitive, runs barefoot, head covered, clothes rent, right? And that's the downfall of David, all the way down. One sin. But you see the good part about David when he was confronted. The moment he was confronted by Gad, you are the man that sinned. David said, I have sinned against the Lord. Immediately, unlike Saul who keeps giving excuses, David could have said, well, I was there, and why did she bathe on the rooftop? She knows my roof is higher than her roof. He could have given 100 excuses. He didn't. He confessed his sin straight away, and God forgave him. All that is you can find in the Psalms. David writes a lot of these Psalms that expresses his repentance and the forgiveness, the sweetness of God's forgiveness. Actually, David's more remembered as a psalmist than as a king for us, right? As a king, he's more like a failure. As a psalmist, he's still the top psalmist of the songwriter of the Bible. Now, the last part of this book is very amazing. David is still proud. All people who rise to the top struggle with this thing called pride, and he wanted to count census of his mighty military men. So he ordered a census of his mighty men. And Joab said, don't do it, don't do it. And when David insisted, God punished his pride. You know, God had brought him up from being a shepherd. God had made him king of the greatest kingdom ever that would ever be in Israel. And yet, he forgot. He thought he made himself great. You know, you can't help it when you become wealthy. You think, it must be my smartness that made me wealthy. You know, you just can't help it. You just like to steal the glory from God. So what happens? God sends a pestilence. I cut a long story short, and 70,000 people died. This is the last chapter of 2 Samuel. And David sees 70,000. I mean, can you imagine 70,000 people die because of your stupid sin of pride? And he doesn't know what to do, and Gad, the prophet, tells him, go, offer an offering on the threshing floor of Araunah. He said, what's all this significance? So David offers burnt offering on the threshing floor of Araunah. And that doesn't even, the story is over after that, and the plague ends, the pestilence ends. So it's like, what's all the story about, man? So many adventures. It's kind of, you listen to it, it's like almost 3 hours of irrelevant stories almost. Some are bizarre, all right? Some details are so, and it's good if you're a preacher. There's a lot to preach about from case studies. It's good if you like to be a Sunday school teacher. A lot of interesting stories you could pick here and pick there and make a lot of moral lessons from it. And that's what we do in Christianity. We use the Bible as a storybook for morals. That's pretty good. Teach our kids how to behave properly, how to trust God. And then we use the Bible as a preaching tool so we can teach our members, about the problems of sin that could affect our life, and then you could be a Bible school teacher, a seminary teacher. There's a lot to do PhD studies on, and it looks like, wow, the Bible is full of all this stuff. No. All of it is one amazing lead up for 1,000 years. It's still a trend, a very critical trend. And what it is? The threshing floor of Araunah, if you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, it says, is Moriah. Hope you see the trend now. Moriah. When did you first hear that? Remember, we heard Moriah in Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. He brought Isaac up to sacrifice on Moriah. That's this place. Now, 1,000 years later, David sacrifices a burnt offering to save the lives. This animal, a substitute for the lives of the people of Jerusalem. Wow. And then 1,000 years after this, Jesus Christ is sacrificed on Mount Moriah. I hope you see the story. Otherwise, it's just a bundle of somewhat unrelated stories. So disjointed. Sometimes so bizarre. Do I have to listen to all this? And until you see that there is a trend that God is telling us, one day the king, not David, son of David, the king, will give a sacrifice on this same place, not an animal, but himself. Right? So I hope you see 2 Samuel in the way of God's beautiful redemption story, the beautiful book, the love story of how God loves us, patiently hangs in with us, teaches us lessons along the way, but all of it leading to us having that eternal relationship, a final romance with God in for all eternity. The beautiful book. God bless you.